Your mortgage, your grocery bill, your gas price, your salary, your retirement account, your health insurance, your kids' college fund, and the cost of every single thing you bought this week are all subsidized by something you have never been told about and cannot see, and are about to lose. It is called the American Empire. And it is not a metaphor, it is a machine. A financial, military, and institutional machine that has been running since 1945, that has organized the entire planet around the US dollar, that has kept your borrowing costs low, your consumer goods cheap, your gas affordable relative to every other developed nation on Earth, and your standard of living artificially elevated above what your economy alone would produce. You did not build it, you were born inside it, and every advantage you have ever had, whether you knew it or not, has flowed from it. And it is ending, right now, not in theory, in data. Project Syndicate says American hegemony is collapsing before our eyes. The Financial Times says the era of U.S. dominance in economic warfare is over. The Guardian compared the Iran war to the moment that killed the British Empire. The Friday Times called the Hormuz crisis the final chapter of the unipolar financial era. A peer-reviewed academic paper documented that China has reached 80 to 100% of American power, the exact threshold where empires historically go to war or lose their position. And BRICS, which now has more economic weight than the G7, launched joint naval drills under Chinese leadership 3 days after the U.S. intervened in Venezuela. And you were not told about any of it. When the British Empire ended, the pound was devalued, prices surged, austerity programs were imposed, the National Health Service was gutted, home ownership became harder, wages stagnated, and an entire generation experienced downward mobility for the first time. When the Soviet Empire ended, male life expectancy dropped 7 years in a single decade. Savings were wiped out by hyperinflation, the middle class was erased overnight, and oligarchs bought the country's assets for pennies, while 280 million people sank into poverty. Those are not ancient history, those are your parents' lifetime. And the United States is following the same trajectory, with the same math and the same warning signs, and the same population that does not believe it can happen here. This video is different from anything I have ever made. I am not going to tell you the empire is falling. I have already made that video. This video is about what happens to you personally the morning after. What happens to your mortgage when the 30-year fixed rate disappears because the bond market that supports it contracts. What happens to your groceries when the dollar buys 30% less on the global market? What happens to your kids when being American is no longer an economic advantage for the first time in 80 years? And what you can do, starting today, to build a life that does not need the empire to survive. Because the empire is ending, but you do not have to end with it. The world's most prestigious publications are now using the word end to describe American hegemony, and they are not whispering it anymore. Project Syndicate, which calls itself the world's opinion page and publishes Nobel laureates, heads of state, and the most cited academics on Earth, ran a headline in April 2026 from a Swedish political science professor that said American hegemony is collapsing before our eyes. Not declining, not weakening, collapsing. Before our eyes. The Financial Times, which is the most respected financial publication in the English-speaking world, published a piece from a Cornell history professor who argued that the era of U.S. dominance in economic warfare is over. Over. The Guardian's Owen Jones compared the Iran War to the Boer War and called it a hollow victory that marks the beginning of the end of empire. The South China Morning Post ran a piece comparing the Iran War to the Suez Crisis of 1956, which is the event that historians universally agree signaled the end of the British Empire as a global power. And the Friday Times published a long-form analysis in March 2026 with a sentence that should be framed and hung in every living room in this country. The waves of the Hormuz and the drones over the Middle East have not just halted oil tankers. They have ended the era of unchallenged dollar hegemony that defined the last half-century. That is not a YouTuber saying that is a published geopolitical analysis with sourced data and academic citations. And a peer-reviewed academic paper published in February 2026 by a master's candidate in criminology and law at Eastern University, titled Global Power Shift: Is the United States Losing Dominance in the Emerging Multipolar World Order?, documented that the international system is no longer centered on the G7, that the institutionalization of the Global South via BRICS has created alternative centers of gravity, and that AFK, Organsky's power transition theory, places China at 80 to 100% of the hegemon's power as of 2026, which is exactly the threshold at which the theory predicts the greatest risk of systemic war. And here is why this matters to you personally, right now, today. Because the question this video is asking is not whether the American empire is ending. That question has been answered. Project Syndicate says yes. The Financial Times says yes. The Guardian says yes. The South China Morning Post says yes. Academic researchers say yes. The only people who have not said yes are the people who benefit from you not knowing. The question this video is asking is what happens to you when it does? What happens to your groceries, your gas, your mortgage, your job, your retirement, your dollar, your safety, your daily life? Because empires do not end in a vacuum. They end inside the lives of the people who live in them. And the 330 million Americans who wake up every morning inside this empire are about to discover what it feels like when the architecture of global power that has defined every aspect of their existence for 80 years shifts underneath them. The British discovered it after Suez. The Soviets discovered it after Afghanistan. The Romans discovered it over centuries, and the Americans are discovering it right now, in real time, whether they recognize it or not. And the reason most Americans do not recognize it is because they were taught that the end of an empire looks like an explosion. It does not. It looks like Tuesday. It looks like a gas price that went up 54% in 87 days. It looks like a grocery bill that makes you feel sick. It looks like a retirement account that lost $105,000 in 8 weeks. It looks like a woman crying at a gas pump because she does not know how she is going to get to work. That is what the end of an empire looks like from the inside. And you are looking at it. The dollar will lose its reserve status, and when it does, the single greatest economic privilege in the history of the world disappears, and every American pays the price. Let me explain something to you that changes everything once you understand it, and that most Americans have never been taught. The reason you can buy a house with a 30-year mortgage at a rate that would be unthinkable in any other country is the dollar. The reason the U.S. government can run a $1.9 trillion deficit and still function is the dollar. The reason gasoline has been historically cheaper in America than in Europe, the reason consumer goods are cheaper, the reason interest rates have been lower, all of it comes back to one thing. The dollar is the world's reserve currency, and that means every country on earth needs dollars to buy oil, to settle trade, to hold as savings. And because everyone needs dollars, there is always massive demand for them. And massive demand means the U.S. can print more money without triggering the inflation that would destroy any other country's currency. And it can borrow at artificially low rates because the whole world is competing to lend to it. That is the exorbitant privilege. It is the single greatest economic advantage any nation has ever had, and it is disappearing. The Friday Times called the 2026 Gulf crisis the final chapter of the unipolar financial era. They documented that the transition from gradual erosion to kinetic collapse began on February 28th with the launch of Operation Epic Fury, Tehran's response, closing the strait and forcing the world to choose between American financial architecture and energy survival turned de-dollarization from theory into operational reality. The IMF confirmed the dollar's share of global reserves fell to 56.9%, the lowest since 1995. Central banks purchased over 1,100 tons of gold in 2024 and 863 in 2025. China's CIPS processes $25 trillion annually across 117 countries. Iran is charging yuan tolls at the strait. BRICS, which now includes Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran, is building payment infrastructure that bypasses the dollar entirely. And what happens to you when the reserve status erodes or collapses? Everything gets more expensive, permanently. Because without the massive global demand for dollars, the U.S. government cannot borrow as cheaply. Interest rates rise. Mortgage rates rise, car loan rates rise, credit card rates, which are already at 23%, go higher. The cost of servicing the national debt, already above $1 trillion a year, explodes because the government has to pay more to attract buyers for its bonds. And inflation becomes harder to control because the dollar buys less on the global market, which means every imported good, every barrel of oil, every piece of electronics, every article of clothing manufactured overseas costs more. The British pound lost its reserve status between 1945 and 1965. During that period, Britain went through repeated currency crises, devaluations, austerity programs, and a standard of living decline that fundamentally changed what it meant to be British. The average British household in 1950 was wealthier relative to the global average than the average British household in 1970. The reserve currency loss did not make Britain a poor country. It made Britain a normal country. And for a population that had been living with extraordinary privilege for generations, normal felt like poverty. That is what is coming for the United States. Not third world conditions, not collapse into chaos, something more psychologically devastating. The discovery that the life you have been living was subsidized by a privilege you did not earn and cannot keep. And when that privilege disappears, the gap between what things cost and what you can afford widens permanently. And every American who grew up believing they lived in the richest country on earth discovers that the richness was partly real and partly borrowed, and the borrowed part is being called back. Middle East Eye just published a piece comparing the Iran war to Suez and what happened to British citizens after Suez is a roadmap for what is about to happen to you. On March 27, 2026, Middle East Eye published an analysis with a headline that reads like a history textbook written in advance. Suez was the death knell for the British Empire. Hormuz may do the same for the US, and the author did not hedge. He wrote that empires decline when their military reach outpaces their political strategy, when their economic foundations weaken, and when the people they seek to dominate endure long enough to outlast their overwhelming force. He said the Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed Britain's financial vulnerability, triggered a run on sterling, hastened its decline as a global reserve currency, and forced imperial retreat. And now I need to tell you what happened to the ordinary people of Britain after that. Because this is your future if the comparison holds, and the comparison is holding. After Suez, Britain entered a period of managed decline that lasted approximately 20 years. The pound sterling, which had been the world's reserve currency for over a century, was devalued multiple times. In 1967, Prime Minister Harold Wilson was forced to devalue the pound by 14% and went on national television to tell the British people that the pound in your pocket has not been devalued. It was the most famous economic lie in British history, and everyone knew it. Prices rose immediately. Import costs surged. The cost of food, clothing, and consumer goods increased because Britain imported much of what it consumed. And when your currency buys less, everything from abroad costs more. The British government imposed austerity programs. Public spending was cut. Infrastructure investments stalled. The National Health Service, which had been the crown jewel of the post-war welfare state, faced chronic underfunding that persists to this day. Universities raised fees. Social housing construction slowed. And the era of managed decline produced a generation of Britons who experienced something their parents never had: downward mobility. The children of the empire lived better than the children who came after the empire. Home ownership became harder. Wages stagnated relative to costs. And the sense of national identity that had been built on being the center of the world was replaced by the psychological disorientation of being a mid-sized island nation that no longer mattered the way it used to. After Suez, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and India all took the measure of British decline and reoriented their trade and their policies accordingly toward the US, toward Asia, toward what would soon be called the Third World. Britain's allies did not wait for the formal end. They moved the moment they saw the trajectory. And that is already happening to the United States. The BRICS expansion, the CIPS alternative, the yuan tolls at Hormuz, the gold buying, the academic papers concluding that China has reached 80 to 100% of American power. The allies are already reorienting. And the American people, like the British people before them, are the last to know, because the government does not announce the end of empire. It manages the decline quietly, through devaluations and austerity and benefit cuts and rising costs, until one day you realize that the country you are living in is not the country you grew up in, and it never will be again. That is not a prediction. That is what happened to Britain. And the Middle East Eye is telling you it is happening again. Right now, when the Soviet Empire fell in 1991, male life expectancy dropped by 7 years in a single decade, and the middle class was erased overnight. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. And what happened to the 280 million people inside it is the closest precedent for what could happen to 330 million Americans if the imperial system collapses abruptly rather than declining gradually. Russian male life expectancy dropped from 63.5 years in 1990 to 57.6 years by 1994, a loss of nearly 6 years in 4 years. By the end of the decade, it had fallen to 59, 7 years of life erased from an entire population of men in a single decade. The causes were the same ones that are already trending upward in the United States right now: alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, cardiovascular disease from chronic stress. What researchers would later call, in the American context, deaths of despair. Russia's GDP contracted by roughly 40% during the 1990s, 40%. Entire industries shut down. Factories that had employed tens of thousands of people simply closed. Savings were wiped out by hyperinflation. A ruble that could buy a month of groceries in January could not buy a loaf of bread by December. Pensions that retirees depended on became worthless. The social safety net, which had provided universal health care, universal education, guaranteed employment, and subsidized housing, disintegrated. And a class of oligarchs emerged, who bought state assets for pennies on the dollar during privatization schemes, concentrating obscene wealth in the hands of a few, while the population cratered into poverty. That is the abrupt collapse scenario, and I am not saying the United States will follow the Soviet path exactly. The U.S. has stronger institutions, a more diversified economy, and a resilient if exhausted population. But the patterns rhyme. The United States already has 264,000 deaths of despair annually. Life expectancy has already declined for 3 consecutive years before the pandemic and has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels. The opioid and fentanyl crisis mirrors the alcoholism epidemic that killed Russian men in the 1990s. Household savings are already depleted. The typical working American has less than $1,000 saved for retirement. Credit card debt is at record highs, with the poorest borrowers at 99.2% utilization. And the concentration of wealth at the top 1% holding 31%, while the bottom 50% holds 2.6%, is approaching the kind of oligarchic structure that defined post-Soviet Russia. And here is the detail that nobody talks about. When the Soviet Union fell, the people who suffered the most were not the poorest. They were the middle class, because the poorest had nothing to lose. They were already at the bottom. But the middle class, the teachers, the engineers, the factory managers, the office workers, the people who had built a stable life inside the system, they lost everything when the system collapsed. Their savings were worthless, their pensions were worthless, their jobs disappeared. Their status evaporated, and they were plunged into a poverty they had not prepared for because they believed the system would hold. That is the American middle class right now. Living paycheck to paycheck despite making good money. No savings, maxed credit, dependent on a social security system that is insolvent in 6 years. Working in industries that are being automated by AI. Owning homes that they cannot afford to insure. And telling themselves the system will hold because it always has. The Soviet middle class told themselves the same thing. Right up until December 26, 1991, when it did not. America will not disappear if the empire ends, but the version of America you know will, and what replaces it looks nothing like what you were promised. I want to be very precise about what I mean when I say the American empire ends, because I think a lot of people hear that phrase and imagine a Hollywood disaster movie. Cities on fire, martial law, roving gangs, the collapse of civilization. That is not what happens. That is not what happened to Britain. That is not what happened to France. That is not what happened to the Netherlands or Spain or Portugal or any of the other imperial powers that lost their empires and continued to exist as nations. What happens is something more subtle and in many ways more psychologically devastating than a dramatic collapse. What happens is a repricing. Everything in your life that was made possible by imperial privilege gets repriced to reflect the cost of being a normal country. And you do not know how much of your life was subsidized by empire until the subsidies disappear. Start with your mortgage. The reason 30-year fixed-rate mortgages exist in the United States and virtually nowhere else in the world is because the dollar's reserve status creates a uniquely deep and liquid bond market that allows banks to offer long-term fixed lending. In most countries, mortgages are adjustable. 5 years, 10 years, then they reset. When the dollar loses reserve status, the bond market that supports 30-year fixed lending contracts, new mortgages become shorter-term and adjustable. Your monthly payment becomes uncertain, and the housing market, which is built on the assumption of stable long-term debt, restructures from the foundation up. Move to your grocery store. The United States imports approximately 15% of its food and a much larger share of its off-season produce, seafood, and specialty ingredients. When the dollar is weaker, imports cost more. The $5 avocado becomes $8. The $3 bag of shrimp becomes $5. And the effect compounds across the store because even domestically produced food relies on imported inputs like machinery, parts, packaging materials, and fertilizer. When the dollar buys less internationally, the cost of producing food domestically rises. Move to your gas station. The reason gasoline has historically been cheaper in America than in Europe is partly because of lower taxes, but largely because oil is priced in dollars. When you are the country that prints the currency that oil is priced in, you have a structural advantage. When that advantage erodes, when oil is increasingly traded in yuan and rupees and euros and BRICS settlement currencies, the American consumer loses the discount they never knew they had. Gas that was $3 in the imperial era becomes $5 in the post-imperial era, permanently. Not because of a war, because of math. Move to your military. The 750 bases in 80 countries that project American power cost approximately $100 billion a year to maintain, according to the Quincy Institute. When the empire can no longer afford them, the bases close. And when the bases close, the trade routes that American warships protect become unprotected. And when the trade routes are unprotected, the shipping insurance premiums that determine the cost of every imported good in your store increase. And you pay more for everything. Again, not because of inflation, because of the withdrawal of the Imperial Security Guarantee that kept shipping costs low and moved to your sense of identity. This is the one that nobody talks about because it cannot be measured. But when the British Empire ended, the British people went through a generational identity crisis that produced everything from punk rock to Brexit. The question of who are we, if we are not the empire, consumed British politics and culture for decades. And the United States, which has built its entire national identity on the idea that it is exceptional, that it is the greatest country in the world, that it is the shining city on a hill, will face the same reckoning. Who are we if we are not the empire? That question is coming, and the country does not have an answer yet. 3 days after the Venezuela intervention, BRICS launched joint naval drills off the coast of South Africa under Chinese leadership, and you were not told. The European Council on Foreign Relations published a report in February 2026 with a detail that should have been breaking news in every American household and was not covered by a single major U.S. network. 3 days after the United States intervened in Venezuela in January 2026, BRICS plus countries launched joint naval drills off the coast of South Africa. China, Iran, Russia, South Africa, and the UAE sent warships. Brazil, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Indonesia joined as observers, all under Chinese leadership. That is 9 countries representing over 3 billion people, conducting coordinated military exercises in direct response to an American military action. Within 72 hours, under the command of the country the United States considers its primary strategic rival. And nobody in America was told. The ECFR noted that BRICS has moved from a largely economic focus to acquire a more geopolitical character. It is no longer a trade bloc. It is a power alliance. And the 18th BRICS Summit is scheduled to be hosted by India in 2026, with the motto Building for Resilience, Innovation, Cooperation, and Sustainability. The current members include Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the UAE. BRICS Plus now has more aggregate wealth in purchasing power parity terms than the G7 according to Brookings. Let me say that again. The bloc that most Americans have never heard of now has more economic output than the group of nations that has run the global economy since 1975. And Chatham House, which is the most prestigious foreign affairs think tank in the UK, published a piece describing the emerging world as multiplexity. A world where no single nation or cluster of powers dominates, where China becomes preeminent in development and trade, where the EU remains a force in regulation, where regional powers like India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Mexico, and Nigeria manage their own affairs through their own institutions, and where countries hedge rather than align, avoiding rigid alliances and instead choosing partners based on deals rather than ideology. That is a world where the United States is not the center, it is one of several players, and the practical implications for your life are enormous. When America was the unipolar hegemon, it set the rules of trade, the standards for currency, the terms for shipping, the interest rate environment, the energy architecture, and the military security framework for the entire planet. And you benefited from every single one of those things without knowing it. The cheap imports, the low interest rates, the stable shipping lanes, the reliable energy supply. All of it flowed from a position of dominance that other countries accepted because they had no alternative. BRICS is the alternative. And it is no longer theoretical. It conducted naval drills 3 days after an American military action. It has $25 trillion flowing through CPS annually. It has Saudi Arabia and the UAE inside its membership. It has more economic weight than the G7, and it is building a financial architecture that allows countries to trade, settle debts, and hold reserves without touching the dollar. When that architecture is complete, the United States loses the ability to sanction countries out of the global economy because the global economy will have a door that does not go through Washington. And when America loses the ability to project economic power through sanctions, the only lever left is military. And a country that is $39 trillion in debt, spending $1 trillion a year on interest, fighting $1 billion a day war it cannot afford, and unable to recruit enough healthy young people to fill its own ranks, does not have a military lever that works for much longer either. BRICS is not the enemy. BRICS is the replacement. And the replacement is already operational. Your children will live in a world where being American is not an advantage, and that is the first time in 80 years that has been true. Since 1945, being born American has been the single greatest economic advantage a human being could have on this planet. Not because Americans are smarter or harder working or more virtuous than anyone else, because the country they were born into sat at the center of a global system that funneled wealth inward. The dollar was the reserve currency. The trade routes were protected by American ships. The institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, were designed by Americans and operated under American rules. The technology, from the transistor to the internet to the smartphone, was invented here first and exported to the world. And the cultural dominance, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, gave American citizens a soft power premium that opened doors in every country on earth. An American passport was not just a travel document, it was a master key. It unlocked better exchange rates, better visa terms, better business opportunities, better treatment at borders, and a default assumption of competence and credibility that no other nationality carried. Your grandparents knew this. Your parents knew it instinctively, and you have benefited from it every day of your life without ever being told it was there. And that advantage is disappearing. The ITF confirmed that China overtook the US in total R&D investment for the first time. Foreign Affairs published America is losing the innovation race. The dollar's reserve share fell to 56.9%. Central banks are buying gold at record pace. BRICS has more economic weight than the G7. And 180,000 American citizens emigrated last year while net migration went negative for the first time since the Great Depression. The master key is losing its teeth. And for the children being born in the United States right now, the world they grow up in will not be the world their parents grew up in. It will be a world where a Chinese engineer, an Indian entrepreneur, a Brazilian developer, and a Nigerian innovator all have access to global markets, global capital, and global education at levels that close the gap with their American counterparts. A world where speaking Mandarin or Hindi or Portuguese opens as many doors as speaking English. A world where holding a U.S. passport does not guarantee you the best exchange rate, the easiest visa, or the assumption that you come from the country that runs the planet. And here is the part that will feel most personal. Your children will not earn less because they are less capable. They will earn less because the imperial premium that inflated their parents' wages no longer exists. The high salaries that Americans have historically earned relative to workers in other countries were not purely a product of skill or education. They were partly a product of imperial architecture. The reserve currency kept borrowing costs low. The trade rules favored American companies. The military security framework kept supply chains stable and cheap. When that architecture contracts, the wages that depended on it contract with it. Not overnight, but over a generation. And the child born in 2026 who graduates college in 2048 will enter a job market that looks nothing like the one their parents entered. It will be a global market where American workers compete on skill alone, without the structural advantage that made a mediocre American worker more valuable than a skilled worker anywhere else. And that is not a tragedy. It is a correction. It is the world becoming fairer. But for the people who grew up inside the advantage, fairness feels like loss. And your children will be the first generation of Americans in 80 years who experience it. The military that protects your way of life is already too expensive to maintain, too broken to staff, and fighting a war that is accelerating every problem that was already killing it. Brookings published an analysis in April 2026 titled Peril and Possibility, Collapsing Old Order, Emerging Disorder, or New Order. And inside it was a sentence that should have made every military strategist in the Pentagon put down their coffee. They wrote that India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and many other countries have wealth and power and their own trading networks. And individually, in some cases, as well as collectively, they have the means to counterbalance the United States and China in key regions, if not globally. Counterbalance the United States and China. That is a statement that would have been laughable 5 years ago. Middle powers counterbalancing the U.S. military, but it is not laughable anymore because the U.S. military is breaking under the weight of its own cost, its own overextension, and its own inability to recruit. The defense budget was $886 billion in fiscal year 2024, with a proposed increase to $1.5 trillion. The country maintains 750 military bases in at least 80 countries. It is fighting a war in Iran that costs $1 billion per day using a 200-to-1 cost ratio against an enemy whose strategy is to bleed America financially, and only 23% of Americans aged 17 to 25 are eligible to enlist without a waiver. 77% are disqualified by obesity, mental health, drug use, or education failures. The Army raised the enlistment age to 42 and is paying $50,000 signing bonuses because it cannot find enough healthy young people to defend the country. And the Hoover Institution documented that beginning in 2026, a 10% reduction in the number of eligible young people turning 18 each year will hit due to the Great Recession birth rate decline. The pool is shrinking at the exact moment the demands are expanding. And here is what the end of the military empire looks like for your daily life. The 750 bases protect trade routes. Those trade routes carry the goods that fill your stores, the oil that fills your tank, and the components that fill your factories. When the bases close because the country can no longer afford them, the trade routes become unprotected. And unprotected trade routes become expensive trade routes, because shipping insurance premiums, known as war risk premiums, are added to every vessel that passes through contested waters. Those premiums are already surging because of the Iran war. And when America can no longer afford to police the global commons, every nation with a navy starts projecting power into the spaces America vacated. China in the South China Sea, Russia in the Arctic, regional powers in the Indian Ocean, and the stable, predictable, American-secured trade framework that has kept the cost of imported goods artificially low for 80 years fractures into a patchwork of regional security arrangements, where the cost of moving goods reflects the actual risk of moving them, and that cost gets passed to you. In higher prices, in longer delivery times. In products that used to be cheap becoming expensive, and products that used to be available becoming scarce. The military is not separate from the economy. The military is the economy. It is the invisible subsidy that makes global trade affordable. And when the military can no longer sustain its global presence because the budget is consumed by interest payments and the ranks cannot be filled, and the war in Iran is draining resources at $1 billion a day, the subsidy disappears. And the cost of everything in your life adjusts upward to reflect a world where the American military is no longer standing between you and the true price of global commerce. That adjustment has already begun, and it will not reverse. Richard Wolff, one of the most cited economists in America, went on Al Jazeera and said the empire has peaked and we are on the way down and we try to hold on. Richard Wolff is a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He has been studying capitalist systems for over 50 years. He is not a fringe voice. He is not a YouTuber. He is one of the most widely cited economists in the American academic system. And he went on Al Jazeera and said something that should have stopped the country cold. He said the American empire has peaked, and we are on the way down, and we try to hold on. And then he said it is a very difficult experience for Americans to realize that they lost wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. 3 wars, 3 losses. 3 imperial overextensions that cost trillions of dollars and achieved none of their stated objectives, and left the country weaker, poorer, and more divided than before they started. And now a 4th war in Iran that is costing $1 billion a day and has closed the most important energy choke point on Earth and is accelerating the disdollarization that Wolff and every serious economist has been warning about for a decade. And the countercurrents analysis published 4 weeks ago laid out what the emerging world order actually looks like. China's rise has been especially transformative, they wrote. Through trade, infrastructure investment, advanced manufacturing, and technological development, Beijing has emerged as a global actor capable of challenging Western economic dominance. Russia, despite sanctions and geopolitical isolation, continues to exert military and strategic influence. India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia are all asserting independence from the American-led system. And several European governments adopted more cautious and independent positions than might have been expected during earlier periods of American dominance. Even Europe is hedging. Even America's closest allies are making contingency plans for a world where the United States is no longer the center. And here is what that means for the American worker, the American retiree, the American family that is already stretched to the breaking point. When the world no longer organizes itself around American power, the economic flows that have enriched America for 80 years start redirecting. Investment that used to flow into American markets because they were the safest and most liquid flows into Chinese bond markets, into Indian tech, into BRICS infrastructure funds. Talent that used to flow to American universities because they were the only option flows to Tsinghua, to IIT, to the European research institutions that are now absorbing the American scientists displaced by federal research cuts. Manufacturing that used to be outsourced to cheap labor and imported back on American-secured trade routes gets reshored into regional supply chains that serve Asian and African markets and bypass America entirely. And the jobs that depended on America being at the center of those flows, the finance jobs, the consulting jobs, the logistics jobs, the tech jobs that served a global market that used to run through New York and San Francisco, those jobs shrink, not because the work disappears, because the work moves to wherever the new center of gravity is. And the American worker is left standing in a country that still has 330 million people, but no longer has the structural advantage that made those 330 million people wealthier than their global counterparts. Wolf was right. The empire has peaked, the descent is underway, and the people at the top know it, which is why they are the ones buying gold and selling real estate and moving capital offshore and making sure their assets are denominated in something other than the currency they can see weakening. They are holding on, as Wolf said, but they are holding on to their lifeboat, not to yours. The empire is ending, but you are not, and the people who understand that distinction are the ones who will build what comes next. I have spent this entire video telling you what happens when the American empire ends, and I know that for a lot of you, this is the most unsettling thing you have ever heard on this channel. Because it is one thing to hear that grocery prices are going up, or that the job market is bad, or that the stock market might crash. Those are problems with solutions. You can cut spending, you can find a new job, you can rebalance your portfolio, but the end of an empire is not a problem with a solution. It is a transformation. And transformations do not ask for your permission, and they do not wait for you to be ready. They just happen. And you either adapt, or you get ground between the gears of the old world and the new one. And I refuse to leave you at the bottom of that pit, because here is the thing that every doom video on this platform leaves out. Empires end. People do not. The Roman Empire fell. The people of Rome kept living. They kept farming. They kept building. They kept raising families. They adapted to a world that no longer had legions protecting the roads and aqueducts carrying the water. And they built new systems, local systems, community systems, systems that were smaller and less grand but functional and human, and theirs. The British Empire fell. The people of Britain went through 20 years of difficult adjustment and came out the other side with a national health service, a cultural renaissance, and an identity that was no longer dependent on ruling the world. It was painful. It was disorienting. But Britain did not cease to exist. It just stopped being an empire and started being a country. And that is what is ahead for the United States. Not the end of the country, the end of the empire. And the beginning of something else. Something that could be better if enough people build it intentionally instead of letting it happen to them by accident. And here is what building looks like at the individual level. It looks boring. It looks unglamorous. It looks like the exact opposite of the dramatic crisis footage that fills your feed every day. It looks like a person who builds a 6-month emergency fund and then does not touch it, like a person who pays off their credit card debt at 23% interest and never carries a balance again, like a person who stocks a pantry with shelf-stable food and rotates it quietly without posting about it, like a person who learns to grow tomatoes and peppers and herbs in their backyard because self-reliance starts with the smallest act of refusing to be entirely dependent on a system that is contracting. It looks like a person who learns a skill that cannot be replaced by AI, something physical, something creative, something that requires a human being in a room. Plumbing, welding, carpentry, cooking, teaching, nursing, repair, the trades that the post-imperial economy will need more than it needs another marketing analyst or middle manager or prompt engineer. It looks like a person who knows their neighbors, who can knock on the door next to theirs and ask for a cup of sugar or a ride to the pharmacy or help moving a couch. Because when the empire contracts and the systems that used to take care of you get smaller and more expensive and less reliable, the people who have a community survive, and the people who are isolated fall, every time, in every empire, throughout all of history. And it looks like a person who stops waiting for Washington to fix it. Because Washington cannot fix it. Washington is $39 trillion in debt, paying $1 trillion in interest, governed by people with 7% public confidence, and fighting a war that is accelerating the very decline it should be trying to prevent. Washington is not going to rescue you. Washington is the thing you need to be rescued from. So rescue yourself. Not with panic, not with fear, with the quiet, steady, unglamorous work of building a life that does not depend on the empire to sustain it. A life that is rooted in skill, community, self-reliance, and the understanding that the world is changing and the people who change with it are the ones who thrive. The American empire is ending. It will get worse before it gets better, but it will get better, because empires are systems and systems are temporary, but people are permanent. And the 330 million people inside this country are not done, not by a long shot. You just need to stop waiting for the empire to save you and start building something that does not need the empire to survive. Start today. Start small. Start where you are. And I will catch you in the next one.